If you have a Bible, open it up to the book of Romans. If you don't have a Bible, there are scarce few copies in the chairs. We are in the process of selecting the Bibles that we're going to replenish the church with, that then hopefully people can just take home with them if they want. To remind you, Janie Sheedy has put together kind of a pre-reading for the messages. So in your bulletin, there's a devotional reading schedule. Hopefully, many of you have grabbed Tom Wright's or N.T. Wright's All for Everyone on the book of Romans, and there are select readings out of that. If you don't have a copy, there are, 7 or 8 copies still behind the little tech area in the back. So be sure to either grab a copy after the service or get up right now and go get it, because if you're like me, you'll forget. And we bought 200 copies. We got like 7 left, so I'm going to have to obviously purchase some more, but that's a good thing. And so this is volume 1, the first 8 chapters, and then in a few months we can get to chapter 9, and we'll put the second volume out and give those to everybody as well. So make sure you follow along the reading. That people have told me that are that are reading ahead of time. They've been greatly blessed by kind of reading those devotional studies before we do the teaching. We are in the final week, the 4th week of introduction for the book of Romans. I did the introduction, then I did the introduction to the introduction. Actually, the first one was the introduction to the introduction to the introduction to the introduction. So we'll be finished with verse 17 after this morning. Next week, we will plunge into the text in verse 18. And it's a plunge down, not up. It's a rough section, if you will, that we'll be going through for the next several weeks. And we'll be moving at a rather clipping pace. So if you felt the pace is a little quick now, just wait till next week. And to remind you what we've seen so far, I'm going to just do one big clip there, thank you. We have these churches in Rome, these little house churches, and they're unique to anywhere else in Scripture. Bless you. Where's Andrew? Andrew is bringing the water. Thank you. What's unique about these churches are that, first of all, Paul did not establish these churches. That makes them unique. But what makes them really unique is, in every case in the book of Acts, particularly when the Apostle Paul shows up on the scene, Paul would go, or Barnabas would go, or whoever would go, but let's just pick Paul, and he would go first to a synagogue, and this is now outside of Israel. This is in the dispersed areas that the Israelites got dispersed all over the world. And Paul would then first go to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and of course, any rabbi, traveling rabbi that would show up would get a voice in the service, if you will. And so they would give him a chunk of time, and he would preach Jesus to them as the fulfillment of the Old Testament Scriptures. A few people would come to believe in Jesus as Messiah, a few of the Jews, and then he would go out from there and preach it to the Gentiles. More Gentiles would come, and then those converted Gentiles that believed in Jesus would then join the Jewish believers in Jesus. Does that make sense? It was always in that order. Jew first, and then the Gentile would join them. But this is not the case in the Roman Church. We looked at the history last week. Here, for the second time in some 20 years, the Emperor of Rome kicked the Jews out of Rome. They were all kicked out. And so for a half a dozen years, they're booted out of Rome. And finally, Nero allows them back in just a couple of years before Paul writes this letter. And so now you have Gentile churches where the Jews are joining them. And it sets up kind of a bummer of a dynamic. And the dynamic it sets up is that the Gentiles think, well, clearly God is done with these Jewish people. They were never faithful anyway. So that this idea of supersessionism starts in. And they say God is done with them. This is the era of the Gentile. The Jews hear that. They see that. And they say, here's the deal. We're the chosen people. We're the people God promised to reach the world through. If he is not faithful to that promise to us, then he's not faithful to anything. And I want nothing to do with him. And so this church is wrestling. They don't know how to get along with each other. They don't know how they should be together. They don't know who's right. And most of all, they don't know where God is in all this. And so Paul, in this letter, wants to get to chapter 12. And in chapter 12, through the rest of the letter, he basically wants to tell them how to get along. What does it look like to be a Jewish-Gentile church together that God has finally brought together? But he can't do that because they don't trust God at all in the first place. Because in their mind, there are two main issues. And you're going to hear these two issues so many times in this series, you'll be nauseous. And that's when I know you'll begin to have heard them enough. You'll probably hear these two issues more times this morning than you care to, and it'll probably make you feel nauseous, and that would be a good thing too. There are two issues of this. First of all, if God has not been faithful to his promises to Israel, then he cannot be trusted, period. So how has God been faithful to the Old Testament? How has he shown up in any way and fulfilled what he promised? And the other issue, which is not just a Gentile issue, it's both Jew and Gentile are struggling with this that are following Jesus. On top of all that, the world is a total train wreck. So how is it in any way God, this God of justice, is justly putting the puzzle back together again? How is he recreating life to make everything great again when everything is such a mess? We, of course, have these same issues in our day as we watch the news, especially these last couple of weeks. And what's cool to me is that God is somehow okay with this questioning. You see, the book of Romans, at least for the first 11 chapters, is a trial. It's a trial, and in this case, God is the judge who sits on the platform, and he is called down off of his platform, and now is the defendant in this trial. And Paul is his lawyer. And so God is on trial for being righteous. Is he righteous? Is he trustworthy? How has God, or hasn't he come through on what he promised? And how is God fixing this world? And so God allows himself to be pulled down off the platform as judge and to stand before people and say, go ahead, question me. Now there will be a day, I will tell you, there will be a day, the book of Revelation speaks of it, the great white throne. Well, God will say, I'm kind of done with all this questioning, because it's quite frankly quite insulting. But for millennia, God has allowed this. In fact, he invites it, which is weird. Now that my noodle has kind of been opened up to this trial scene in Romans, now I'm starting to see that so much of Scripture is actually God on trial. So much of the minor prophets like Jonah or like Habakkuk, which we'll speak of this morning, are God on trial. Brian Fury taught Psalm 63. In a sense, God is on trial in that psalm. Because David is saying, I'm in a weary and dry land. God, where are you? That's God on trial. Much of Scripture is questioning God and his goodness and his kindness and his faithfulness. And it will take 11 chapters for Paul to prove that God has been faithful and that God is going to fix life. And he will do this by literally, through these 11 chapters, rereading the story of Israel in the Old Testament, but he will do it through the lens of Jesus. So he will help us put on the glasses of Jesus to go back to the Old Testament scriptures to see if they're true. Let's go back to the first 4 verses of Romans before we jump into verse 16 and 17. And remind yourself how Paul started this letter. Chapter 1, verse 1. Paul, a bondservant of Messiah Jesus, called as an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through the prophets and the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh, who was declared the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead, according to the Spirit of holiness, Jesus, Messiah, our Lord. Again, somehow Paul is going to prove that God is faithful and thus righteous. In other words, and we're going to see these two things this morning, and really almost 2 sections of this sermon. First of all, that through Jesus, God the Father has actually made good on all of his promises in the Old Testament. We'll do that when we look at verses 16 and 17. And when we look at 16 and 17, Paul will not tell us how Jesus proves this. He will just say he does. And then all the way to the end of chapter 11, he will show how Jesus has proven this in the Scriptures. And on top of that, one step further, Paul will tell us somehow through the resurrection specifically of Jesus, God is now fixing life. See, there's our 2 issues. That in verses 16 and 17, we'll look at this the first half of our sermon, that he'll just simply make the statement, so I want to make sure we understand the statement, that God has made good on his promises through Jesus. And then we'll go back to these first 4 verses this morning in Romans, and we'll see how the resurrection actually is God's answer to making the world right. So hopefully that will make sense, and if not, I can't help it. Let's go with that in mind to verse 16 and 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, Paul says, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous one shall live by faith. So Paul gives this kind of grand opening statement. Many people believe that verse 16 and 17 are the thesis for all of Romans, or at least the first 11 chapters. I would argue that Paul's thesis really is in the first 4 chapters, and he restates it in verses 16 and 17, but that's kind of in it. And what he does in verses 16 and 17 is he makes a statement, I am not ashamed of the gospel. And then he gives 2 successive explanations to say why he's not ashamed of this gospel. And then he gives an Old Testament reference to kind of back that up. So what does he start with? He says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. There's his statement. Now, what he doesn't say is, I'm not ashamed to share the gospel. I think that's true, by the way. And when you see Paul, but what is true on the inside becomes true on the outside. There's a reason. You remember our Easter Sunday, some of you? It was the culmination of our study in Acts. Remember what this guy went through? Shipwrecked several times, stoned to an inch of his life multiple times. I mean, who does that? And it never thwarted him from sharing the gospel. But there's a reason for that. The reason for that is that he wasn't ashamed of it. You see, Paul knew he landed on the it with the gospel. Paul had it. You know, for the first 18 and a half years of my life, and I was raised in church and raised to not live like I lived, but that didn't matter because I'm too smart, as my dad always used to say about himself. I was too smart to listen to anybody, and that was totally true of me. So for the first 18 years of life, 18 and a half years until my end of my first semester in college, I decided I would bang my head on a brick wall to see if it hurt. And so I decided I would milk life for what it was worth, because Doug, in his infinite wisdom, knew how to find the answer to life. And at the end of my first semester, my freshman year, after a massive argument with my father, I realized, wow, I'm a mess. And so I said, God, that's it. For the rest of my life, you're it. You're my it. You're my everything. And I don't even know what that means, but I will relinquish myself, Jesus, to you. Have at it. And I can make this statement to you, and there hasn't been a day where I haven't been able to make it. Not that it's been easy, but I'm not ashamed of that gospel. It has never let me down. There's never been a day where I woke up and said, God, I'm going to walk with you today. Jesus, I'm going to enjoy the blood that washed me clean, and got to the end of my day and said, wow, that was just a waste. Never happened. Never happened once. I'm 51 years old. Never happened one day. There's not another thing in my life I can say that. And that's where Paul's at. I found the it, he says. And I have no shame in saying that. It's my life. And his statement is specifically, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And we've said this before. The gospel is not just the life of Jesus. The gospel is the entire story of God in the Old Testament, culminating in what Jesus did on the cross and resurrected. That's what the gospel is. Particularly, it goes to Genesis 12, where God meets a guy named Abraham and says, I'm going to make you Jewish, and then I'm going to save the world through you. And that's exactly what happens in culminating in Jesus. A Jewish guy comes along who is also God, and he saves the world. That's the gospel. Really, Genesis 12 to the resurrection. There it is. There's the story. And Paul says, it's the it. I'll never be ashamed of it. I'm unabashed on it. And then he gives a reason. Why is Paul not ashamed of this gospel? He says, well, very easily. It has the power to save people. This story of God actually has the power to save people. Not just people, everybody. This is a super powerful gospel. You see, to a Jew, salvation meant more than just being saved from ultimate death and destruction. To a Jew, it also meant being saved from the chaos and darkness and pain right now. It was from now through eternity. That's what it meant to a Jew. So Paul says, I'm not ashamed of this at all. This is the end in my life. And it's the end because it actually saves people. It doesn't just make them happy for 12 minutes. Right? It doesn't just tickle their fancy. It actually saves their life. And how does it do that? Well, he has this weird statement. He says, the gospel saves people because it reveals the righteousness of God from faith to faith. So what on earth does he mean by this? What is Paul saying? Well, Paul says again, I'll stake my life on this gospel, the story of God culminating in Jesus, because this very gospel has the power to save people, and it has the power to save people because it proves that God is not only God, but he's trustworthy. That's why. It's obvious he's there. I mean, the willpower it takes to me to believe in the non-existence of God is just mind-numbing to me. So existence aside, the question is he trustworthy? Is he worth staking my life on? Paul says, oh, are you kidding? The story reveals how trustworthy God is. Again, the gospel culminating in Jesus' death and resurrection shows us what God has been up to all along. And then he makes these two phrases that I want to tackle for just a few minutes. The righteousness of God and faith to faith. What are these two phrases? What does he mean by this? So first of all, the righteousness of God. When the phrase "the righteousness of God" is used not only in the Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures, but even in the the ancient Jewish writings outside the Bible, if you will, it always refers to God's righteousness, not to the righteousness God hands to somebody else. It is always God's righteousness that's being referred to. I can give you a million references if you want to see that. It's interesting. The word God in the letter of Romans comes up in more often than in any of Paul's writings. Every 46 words, Paul names God in this letter. Again, this letter is about God being on trial for being trustworthy. And so, obviously, he's going to come up. So the question again is God's on trial. Has he been just, on one hand, to make things right, but has he also been a faithful partner to come through on his promises? Have you heard that one before? Has he been just to make the world right, but has he also been a faithful partner? Has he come through on what he said he would do? Again, the gospel, meaning the story of God culminating in Jesus, reveals that God has been trustworthy. He's met his covenant faithfulness, and he's bringing justice to renew this world. It's exactly what Paul was saying in chapter 3. But now, apart from the Torah, the righteousness of God, meaning his trustworthiness, has been manifested. Somehow, Paul says, we know God is righteous. It's been revealed to us, he says, because of Jesus' death and resurrection. Somehow, Jesus' death and resurrection proves God has been a faithful partner and can be trusted. Through Jesus, God the Father has now made good on his word. Look at verse 17 now for the second half of this. For the gospel, in it, the righteousness of God, we see how trustworthy he is. It's revealed to us over the course of this story, culminating in Jesus, from faith to faith. Faith to faith. What does that mean? The question is, from whose faith to whose faith? And what he does is he points to an Old Testament quote that any Jewish reader would have known in a second, and almost everybody in here but Jim Garfield knows what it means. Only Jim probably knows what this reference means, right? But the Jewish reader, they know instantly. So he quotes this quote from the book of Habakkuk, "But the righteous one shall live by faith." This is his explanation of faith to faith. Well, what does this mean? Well, the book of Habakkuk is a minor prophet book. And it was written during the time when the Jews were exiled. And so the Jews get exiled by the Babylonians, particularly the Chaldeans, who were the Babylonians that lived in the southern part of Babylon. And they were the elite of the Babylonians. Well, they kicked the Jews off, and the Jews are sitting around in a pile of dirt and ashes. They have no home. They're homeless. And they're saying to themselves, what is going on? See, it's just a book of woe and puzzlement. And the puzzlement is, where is God? in all of this? You see, in the book of Habakkuk, God's trustworthiness is on trial. And so what God does through this prophet Habakkuk, that's a hard thing to say. I'm going to wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night going, Habakkuk, Habakkuk. Through this prophet, God says, I'll give you an answer. And he gives Habakkuk a vision. And in the vision, God tells them, I will come through for you. I know you're in exile. I know you're homeless. I know you've been kicked off your land. I am God. I do what I say. I will come through for you. I will be righteous. And when you see how faithful I am, I want you to take that and turn it back towards me and have faith back to me. That's what he's saying to them. And this is exactly in Jesus' day and in Paul's day what these Jews longed for. Remember, they'd been under foreign oppression for 800 years, ruled by an outside entity. And now they're being ruled by Rome in the same way. And they're saying the same thing. God, where are you? When are you going to make this right and come through on what you told me you would come through on? And God's prophecy through Habakkuk was, I will come through. I'm trustworthy. I'm righteous. I will do it for you. So you need to turn back then, and as a result of that, have faith in me. That's what Paul is going to prove through Jesus. What is Paul saying then? He's saying Jesus lived and died and resurrected. That somehow then proves that God lived up to what he promises, meaning he came through. Now we see the faithfulness of Jesus, the faith of Jesus, and it inspires trust in us and faith in us to have faith back to God. Does that make sense? So what does faith to faith mean? It means the faith of Jesus to our faith back. See, the righteousness of God, the trustworthiness of God is revealed from watching Jesus and the faithfulness by which he gave us on the cross and in his life and in his resurrection. It so moves us that we have faith back. From faith to faith. One last thing. He has this statement, but the righteous one shall live by faith. I actually side with most commentators that this should be a capital R and a capital O. The righteous one is Jesus. See, the righteous one shall live by faith. The righteous one lived by faith. He was faithful to the Father, which then made him faithful to all the Old Testament promises, which we look at the whole story and we say, Jesus, you have come through on behalf of all of humanity, and you stepped in where Israel didn't. Now I have faith in you. See, he's the righteous one. This was the interpretation for 1,500 years until the Protestant Reformation, by the way. And then there was such a need to find out what God had done for us that we began to interpret this as we're the righteous ones who need to exercise faith, but it was never interpreted that way before. Jesus is the great righteous one. He is the righteous one that proves God is faithful to what he promised, and he will make the world right. So if we reread this, do I have this again? I think I have this slide. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It's the right? The story of God culminating in Jesus. Because it has the power to save everybody, Jew and Greek alone, together. For in that story, culminating in Jesus, the righteousness, meaning the trustworthiness, the faithfulness of God, it's shown to us, culminating in Jesus, proving that God is both faithful and just. From Jesus' faith to our faith. As it is written, the righteous one lived by faith. That's the statement. That's what Paul will take 11 chapters to prove. See, and this is strange because Paul is not really telling us how Jesus proves us. He's just making a statement. Here's the deal. Jesus proves God's trustworthy. Now, strap a seatbelt on because from verse 18 all the way to the end of chapter 11, I will prove it. If you're not sure how Jesus, the life and death and resurrection of Jesus proves the Old Testament scriptures, just stick around for the next 4 months and you'll know. And if you don't know that, I can't do any better than that because Paul wrote it and I'll just blame him. So Jesus somehow proves that God will come through. There's the first issue. God, how have you met the promises? Verse 16 and 17 says, I met them in Jesus. Let me explain to you how. Then how on earth are you answering the second question? How are you making the world right? So let's tackle this second thing. How does the resurrection prove that God is fixing this world? When I watched the news this week and watched bombs get hurled between Gaza and Israel, when I watched what went on with Syria, right? When I see all these nuclear weapons being built in Iraq and Iran, it's just insane right now. When I see, this masterful nut in Russia working these rebels to just take over parts of Europe, how am I supposed to buy into the fact that God is somehow making things right? Paul says, here's what the proof is. It's the resurrection. The resurrection is what the proof is, that God will make things right. 13 distinct times in this letter, Paul will point to the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. We only get 4 verses into this letter, and Paul is already talking about the resurrection. So the question is, why does Paul seem to emphasize the resurrection? Well, to look at that, let's look at 2 quick questions. The first question is, what is resurrection to an Old Testament Jew? We need to understand that very quickly. And then we will answer the second question. Then, okay, now that I understand what they expected resurrection to be from the Old Testament, how does Jesus address that? You with me? So, question 1. What is the resurrection to an Old Testament Jew? Well, with all of the deep suffering and pain that the Jews have gone through for over 800 years of foreign domination to the time Paul writes this letter, the whole concept of resurrection grew. See, what was happening when the Jews got kicked off their land around 586 BC, they began to wrestle with, okay, isn't God supposed to fix this? And I'm homeless. Where is he? And so for hundreds of years, the rabbis and the Jews would wrestle with these ancient texts. They would wrestle with Old Testament ancient texts. And they would also wrestle with things like the apocryphal books that you might see in the Catholic Bible, right? And they would wrestle with these prophetic sayings about how God would make things right, because they wanted hope. They wanted to know, God, are you going to make things better? Is there going to be a resurrection? And if there is, when is it? And then I'll put my hope in it that you're going to fix this. This is why you saw things like in the Gospels in Jesus' day, there were huge splits and factions, religious splits, with people like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You see, the Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection anymore. They had given up. They had said, this has been so bad for so long, we're not even going to buy into a resurrection. It's just nihilism almost, right? It's just like, yeah, you just try to live a good life and then we die, and that's just all there is. That was the Sadducees. That's why Jesus argued with them about the resurrection. But the Pharisees, that was a big deal to them. Because in their mind, and they were right, if there's no resurrection, if there's no end to all this mess, where God's going to make it all right, then there's no point in doing anything. I mean, I'm just going to just party up and die. Why would I pursue God if he's not going to fix life? That's what the Pharisees believed. So it was a big deal that they were wrestling with this whole deal. And for these Old Testament Jews, resurrection was a full and final fixing. It was that God would finally come through on his promises and he would fix the world. That's what they were waiting for. And they had all these books that they studied. And the main book, like the commentary of all commentaries on resurrection to an Old Testament Jew, was the book of Daniel. If they had nothing else, the book of Daniel is where they went. And in particular, they went to Daniel chapter 11 and 12. And there's this whole explanation in Daniel 11 and 12 about the end times and about this great war. And then after that great war in chapter 12, this is what God says he will do. Now at that time, Michael, he's the angel that God he assigned to Israel to basically protect them. Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of our people, the Israelites, will rise. And there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. There's resurrection. Many of those who sleep in the dust and the ground will awake, and these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting content. And a super oversimplification, they came to three conclusions about this resurrection, particularly from this text in Daniel. First of all, resurrection to them was the great cosmic reversal. It was the great eschatological movement of God to make everything, boom, great. And then, as a part of that resurrection where God makes things great, they realized that it's not for everybody. And so they developed this thought that the resurrection are for those that followed Torah. And so they had hope. This is why we saw people like the people that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. They literally saw this disgusting stuff going on in the temple like Jesus did, and the disgusting stuff the priests were doing. And they said, we're done with all of this. They moved out of the desert, and you can visit it today and see this commune they built. And they basically said, we will sit here and just copy Scripture and live a good life until we move God to come back and send Messiah to save us. That's what Qumran was. That's what the Dead Sea Scrolls were. They were waiting for the final resurrection, and they would obey Torah until he did it. And as a part of this thought, they thought this thought is not for everybody, it's for Israel. So this is what an Old Testament Jew thought. It's the day of final justice that the resurrection was. It's the day when God would make things right and come through on what he promised. So then, how does the resurrection of Jesus address this? This, if you have been sleeping, is where you want to pay attention. Please hear, if you hear nothing else, hear this. How does Paul say the resurrection of Jesus fixed this world? Go back now to the first 4 verses. And what we'll find is Paul gives us the answer. Paul, a bondservant of Messiah Jesus, verse 1, called as an apostle, set apart for this story of God, culminating in Jesus, which he promised beforehand in the Scriptures, concerning his Son Jesus, who was born of a descendant of David, being an Israelite from Judah, according to the flesh. Now here's his weird comment. Here's his answer. Jesus, who was declared the Son of God with power and authority by the resurrection from the dead. Maybe the better question, rather than how does the resurrection of Jesus address this, maybe the better question is, what happened at the resurrection? To answer this question. This is Paul's answer. Jesus was declared Son of God with authority at his resurrection. Something in the resurrection, when it happened, changed with Jesus. Because the word is declared. What does the word declare tell you? This is not a trick question.
It is.
What's that?
It is.
Just the opposite. It is now. What's the other half of it? It wasn't before. This is a big word. It means appointed, decided upon at that moment. So you're right, Phil. That's half the answer. It's declared from here forward, but, right, Rachel, it wasn't until this point. Something changed. Some status about Jesus changed when he was resurrected. This sounds really weird to Christians. Now, let me clarify. Who he was did not change. It's not like wow, he resurrected, now he's God, or he's more God, or he was only half God, or, it's like he was kind of powerful, and then he resurrected, and wow, now he's the great Almighty. That's just nonsense. Who he was did not change. But what he does, see, his role, his status, actually changed. So what role did Jesus not have that he now took on at the resurrection? In the biblical narrative, when we hear the phrase, Son of God, does this feel like a technical sermon to you? Good, stay with me. The term Son of God in the Old Testament is used for 2 different reasons, not one. And we only think of one when we hear it. The first one is the obvious way. If you hear the phrase in the Old Testament, Son of God, it means Son of God. It means the Son, like the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. It's who he is. So So one way we hear this in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament, by the way, is that Jesus is the Son of God. He always was the Son of God. He is the Son of God. He always will be the Son. He's the Son next to the Father and the Spirit and the Trinity. That's who he is. That did not change. There's another way to say Son of God, and it is not who he is. It was a title. This is what changed. This is the phrase Paul is using. He's not talking about Jesus was declared the Son next to the Father and the Spirit. He was declared the King and Judge at his resurrection. This is what changed. You see, before the resurrection, Jesus was not the King. He was appointed the kingship by his Father. This is why we read these weird phrases in the Messianic Psalms. Some of you are familiar with Psalm 2. This is what it says in Psalm 2. But as for me, I have, here's our declared word, installed my king. You see that? Rachel said it right. He wasn't installed before. Now he's installed king upon Zion, my holy mountain. This is the Father speaking. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, this is the Father speaking to Jesus. He said to me, the Father to the Son, you are my Son. Today I have begotten you. Well, Jesus wasn't begotten as a son. He always was. Jesus didn't get birthed into godhood. He always was God. He got birthed into manhood as a baby on the earth, but he was always God. He wasn't begotten. So what is this begotten? I never thought I'd say that out loud. He was begotten King and Judge. The Father looked at him and said, today I beget you King of the universe. At your resurrection, you should feel this. You see, when Jesus resurrects, he ascends to the Father. He starts the resurrection. He starts the final cosmic reversal. He's the beginning of it. And he ascends to the Father. He sits down next to the Father. And the Father crowns him king. He is appointed Son of God. He is declared King and Judge over the universe. We read this in the book of Acts. And he ordered us to preach to the people and solemnly to testify to this. This is the one, capital O, who has been appointed. Remember? Wasn't before. Appointed by God as judge by the living and the dead. So you say, well, who was king in the Old Testament? The Father was king in the Old Testament. Do you remember the story in the book of Samuel? Where they finally have the nation, and they finally move into the land, and they finally separate the tribes, and they got the whole land, and now they're starting to fight the Philistines. We're going to clear it all out. And they look around and they say, oh, we're missing something. We need a king. And God's totally hurt by this. Samuel's totally hurt by this. And he says, you've already got one. It's God. Well, who's he talking about? The Father was king. Not Jesus. There's not like a giant crown over the three of them. They don't fight over authority like that. They're way more humble than that. They default to one another, unlike us. They appreciate and respect one another. The Father wears the crown in the family of the Trinity. And when Jesus ascends to the Father, get this picture, people. He ascends, he sits next to his Father at his right hand. The Father, listen to the humility of this. He takes his crown off. He's so moved by his Son. And he puts it on his Son and says, you deserve this. You were the one, Colossians says, breathed creation into existence. You're the one that came to earth and created the world, not me. We thought of it all together, but you did it. You're the only one who rightfully should put it back. You're the only one that lived nobly on this planet. You are the only one who's noble enough to rule these people in this kingdom. And he puts the crown on his Son. And his Son takes the scepter and he says, I'll do it for us. I'll do it for them. I will rule and I will make this world right again. I will rule over the powers of darkness. I will kick death and sin in the rear end. And I will do this until I thwart Satan and death
once and for all. This is what we read in the greatest passage in all the New Testament on the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. Listen to this. But now Messiah has been raised from the dead. There's resurrection. The first fruits of those who are asleep. He's the first of the resurrection. He started the great cosmic reversal. For since by a man, this is Adam, came death, and by a man also came the resurrection of the dead. We'll read about this more in Romans 5. For as in Adam all die, so also in Messiah also made alive, but each to his own order. Messiah the first fruits, the beginning of the resurrection. After that, those who are Messiahs, all his coming. That then comes the end. So at the end, when it's all done, he's the ruling king in his resurrection. You and I, for the last 2,000 years, and you and I are still living in his kingdom where he's ruling. In the end, when he's done it, when he's finished it, when he's fixed it, when there's no more war in Syria, when Iraq is not looking like it does, right? When there's no more Ukraine junk going on, when there's no more people fighting over immigration, when it's all done, when he fixes everything, in the end, when he hands over the kingdom to the God and Father, when he has abolished all rule and all authority and power, for he must reign until he has put all of his enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be abolished under the reign of Jesus' kingdom is death. When Jesus has completed his task of conquering evil and death and sin, he will literally take the crown off his head. He will hand it back to his Father. He'll have his little shepherd cloak on and he'll say, Father, I'm finished. And the Father will look back at him and say, I always knew you'd do it. Isn't that cool? And the Spirit's just going to be giggling and laughing the whole time. The three of them looking at this together. It's just an amazing scene. When Messiah has come, he would be crowned king. This was what was expected. This is what should have been expected. That he would come and be declared Son of God with power. And then he would set the whole world right. This is what was promised. All through the Old Testament. The great and grand prophecy that Ezekiel got in the Valley of the Bones. For those of you that know this vision, listen to what it says. And I will make them one nation in the land. On the mountains of Israel, and one king, capital O, capital K, will be king for all of them. My servant David, this is talking about Jesus now. My servant David will be king over them, and they will have one, capital O, shepherd, capital S. And they will walk in my ordinances and keep my statutes and observe them. And they will live on the land that I gave to Jacob, my servant, in which your fathers Israel lived. And they will live on it, they and their sons and their sons' sons. And David, my servant, Jesus, will be their prince forever. Why is he a prince? Because he's done. There's no more. There's no pain. The wolf sits down with the lamb, and he hands the crown back to the Father and says, there's no need for an army, because we did it. We put life back. But in Paul's day, how's it going? Well, in Paul's day, they're under foreign oppression and have been for 800 years. The Jews aren't believing in Messiah en masse. And the world is anything but fixed. Does that sound familiar to you? What gives? Well, this is what Paul will have to speak to. How does Jesus' life, death, and resurrection prove God has come through on his promises? Mostly to Israel. And then how does Jesus' life, death, and resurrection show that God will put things back together again? The long answer is, starting next Sunday, he's going to take 11 chapters to show that Jesus proves God came through. The shorter answer is, Jesus was crowned the King of Kings at his resurrection. He is making things right this morning. The question you and I have to ask is what he asked all the time in the Gospels. Will you have eyes to see and ears to hear? When you go to work and you see the chaos, can you see me in it? See, anybody with lousy eyes can turn the television on and believe the world's in hell and a handbasket. That takes nothing. Absolutely nothing. Your 3-year-old can sit in front of the television and figure it out. But do we have the faith to look for the still small voice of God speaking? Let me say that differently. The still small voice of the Creator, Jesus, speaking life back into his world. By a marriage that's coming back together again. By a person turning their life to God and saying, you know what, I'm going to give you a shot. I'm going to do what Doug said he did when he was 18 and a half. I'm going to name you the end. By being in a godless job all day long and having the chutzpah to say, God, I know you'll produce life here. I just have to watch for it. Right? This is what he's asking us. He's the crowned king. We live in a really heady time. Because when we meet him, when we go to be with him, and he ends this, he will not have a crown on his head like this. He'll have a staff and a cloak and maybe some sheepdog on it, and he'll be Jesus Shepherd again. Now he rules and will fix this place. The question is, do we believe it? See, from faith to faith. Do we see the faithfulness of Jesus? And is it inspiring us to say, God, you're trustworthy. I will shift my heart to believe your reality rather than mine. Let's pray. Father, pierce through the veil and smoke and shadows of this matrix we live in. Make us people that see your reality more than ours. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear, that we may be encouraged, we may have hope, that we may have a sense of the grandeur of the partnership we are in alignment with you on. And then, Father, we thank you. We know ahead of time that with Jesus ruling, you will redeem this world. It would be a bummer if we missed it. Each day, it would be a total bummer. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear. Your great Son and this movement in our world. And as a church, we say, we pray this in the name of Jesus, our